Shared Access Signature, or SAS tokens for short, provide a way to secure least privilege access to your storage services. For example, only allowing a user to read or write blob files but not to delete them. For the purposes of this course and context of Azure CDN, I'll assume you already understand what SAS tokens are used for and how they work. If you're not as familiar, that's okay. The course I mentioned earlier covers configuring security for Azure storage in enough depth for you to follow along with these CDN demos. I'll walk through quickly how to generate a SAS token in a bit, but first, let's discuss what using a SAS token buys you with Azure CDN. As we covered earlier, a CDN works by having edge servers across the world that cache content. We know they cache that content after loading it from an origin server, which in our case is an Azure Storage Blob endpoint. But how does that edge to origin request actually work? Let's add another level of detail to this diagram by being more specific. The origin server in our demos is actually this HTTPS endpoint. And furthermore, if a user is using an HTTP GET to retrieve one of our Contoso Office Gallery images, the edge server is therefore also issuing an HTTP GET request on the user's behalf if it cannot serve it from its local cache. Can you tell where I'm going with this? Really, all we're talking about is typical client-server communication over HTTP. We saw in our previous demos how we set the origin of the CDN to our blob endpoint, but in order to allow the CDN edge servers to retrieve content, we had to make our blob container public. Public as in public to the world. And that means if an Azure CDN server can access the endpoint, guess who else can? Everyone else. Anyone can issue those same GET requests to your content, including malicious Jim here. You might say, well, Jim doesn't know my blob endpoint URL, but we know better. Security by obscurity is no security at all. Jim is crafty, and it's possible you could accidentally leak the endpoint URL somehow. Regardless of how it happens, once Jim or other users know your endpoint URL, your URL with no authentication and public access enabled, it's game over. So what can we do? None of us want to see Jim accessing our content. This is what shared access signatures were created for. As you might know, a SAS is just a set of query parameters that includes a signature that is unguessable because it's signed with one of your secret Azure storage keys. If we can configure Azure CDN to use the SAS tokens and all its requests, then we can successfully lock down our storage service and give specific access to our CDN. There are some considerations I want to call out that I'll recommend when using SAS authentication with Azure CDN. First, it's best practice to associate the SAS token with a stored access policy, as we'll see in a demo shortly. In case you aren't familiar, a stored access policy is a policy you can set on Azure storage service resources such as a blob container to restrict access. This allows you to more easily revoke a SAS token. Since SAS tokens are normally signed with your storage account key, to revoke them you would have to regenerate your key, potentially causing any applications that use that key to be updated. Instead, by associating a SAS token with an access policy, you can revoke tokens by renaming the policy or deleting it, and that will invalidate the token, which will only impact SAS tokens associated with that policy. Second, and this might go without saying, but a CDN will be delegating access on anonymous users' behalf, so it's best to only grant the read permission on the SAS token. I wouldn't recommend granting any other permission like write or delete unless you understand the risks. Remember that a CDN edge server request will be billed as a storage request, so allowing writes or deletes will directly impact your bill, since those types of requests aren't cached by the CDN since they have side effects. Lastly, I recommend using a longer than typical expiration time. This also depends on your level of risk management and automation. Your SAS token expiration informs the max age of your caching rules for Azure CDN. In other words, if you set the expiration time for 1 hour for your SAS token, you shouldn't set your default cache expiration time to be more than an hour because you might have content in the edge server that will be stored for longer than is technically allowed. Instead, I advise setting it to something as reasonable as you can make it. If you can write the automation to automatically generate a new SAS token and assign it to the CDN endpoint, then choose whatever expiration would make sense for your content. However, as we'll see in the following demos, not all CDN profile SKUs can be easily automated, and once the SAS token expires, you will need to manually update some rules in the CDN to use the new token. This is a good point to remind you that a SAS token is a password equivalent. That means you should treat your SAS tokens as secrets and guard them appropriately. Leaking them or having them be compromised will allow malicious Jim to elevate his permissions and run amok with your storage account, and we don't want that. This is why using least privilege access is best. If a token were compromised, malicious users could at most only perform the actions you granted permission to until you revoke the token. It's worth answering the question whether you should always use SAS authentication with Azure CDN. I would argue in most cases you should. Here's why. Your CDN endpoint is the gateway to your storage account. By limiting access through the CDN, you guarantee you have control over the user's requests such as performing URL rewriting, adjusting the cache rules, or rules based on their geography. By its nature, the CDN will reduce storage requests. If you make your blob container public and users found that URL, they could issue requests with no restrictions or potential caching in place. Lastly, I think it just makes the intended use of the storage account clear. By restricting access via SAS token, it's clear to your team or organization that the intended use of the storage account is for public CDN usage. Clarity is important. Now that we better understand why it's important to use SAS authentication with Azure CDN, let's learn how to configure it.